Hello everybody. So in order to begin our course on the legal aspects, we need to get a little bit of a foundation of where our laws originate, how they originate, and how we go about dealing with laws once we have them. And so this first presentation is going to talk about this introduction to the court system, and specifically we're going to then look at Oklahoma and talk about the key players when it comes to Oklahoma schools and what the laws in Oklahoma deal with in general, in the big picture, about education. So to begin with, and some of this may be a little bit elementary to you, but just to make sure, want to make sure that we're all on the same page. When we're talking about the rule of law, we're talking about the three branches of government. The legislative branch is, of course, the branch of government that makes laws. And at the national level, that is the Congress. At the state level, that's the legislature. So keep in mind that because we're dealing with education, and we'll see this as we go through, when we are talking about education, for the most part, we're just going to be dealing with the state legislature because education is a state issue. The executive branch is the branch of government that enforces the law. This is the president at the national level, the governor at the local level or the state level. And once the legislature enacts a law or creates a law, the executive branch then enforces the law by creating agencies that go about and fulfill what the law was. And then finally, there is the judicial branch, which interprets the law, and that is the Supreme Court at both levels. And we'll see that Oklahoma is somewhat a tiny bit unique in the Supreme Court system here in Oklahoma. But in general, it's the Supreme Court at both levels who interpret the laws or resolve disputes. So in the big picture then, on the national scene, this map here shows the 13 federal judicial circuits. I'm going to go to the next map because it shows a little bit better here. And actually, if you look at this map, what you see are 13 circuits, but you also see broken down into smaller regions. So take a look at Oklahoma, and in Oklahoma you have, we're a part of the 10th Circuit Court, which meets in Denver. And within Oklahoma, you have three regions, the western, the eastern, and then the northeastern regions. The western court is located in Oklahoma City. The northeastern court is located here in Tulsa. And the eastern court is located in Muskogee. Now, the reason we have these different regions, these are where the district courts are located. So, when an issue comes before a district court on a federal case, it goes to the federal district court. So in Oklahoma, that's these three regions. From there, the case can be appealed to the appellate court or the appeals court, and that's the court in Denver. And then from there, it can be appealed to the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. Okay, so that's the process of the federal system. There's a district court, an appellate court, and then the Supreme Court. So all of our decisions go to the appellate court in Denver. Now, just a little note about the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court hears cases from all the different appeals courts, and the Supreme Court generally, well, it's not generally, the Supreme Court in reality rarely accepts an appeal from an appellate court. There are a few things that stand out on why the Supreme Court might accept an appeal. So keep in mind that if a Supreme Court hears an appeal, let's say from the 10th Circuit, in Denver, then the ruling by the Supreme Court is going to be cover everybody, all the different appellate courts. So in essence, the whole country. Um, if the Supreme Court does not hear an appeal, let's say from Denver, and the court in Denver has ruled slightly differently than the court in San Francisco, which is head of the Ninth Circuit, um, then those individual rulings are bound within those appellate jurisdictions. Okay, so then why does the Supreme Court hear cases? Well, one of the main reasons the Supreme Court will hear a case is because there are such disparate rulings in the different circuits. So maybe the court in Denver has ruled a certain way, but the Seventh Court in Chicago has ruled a completely different way. And then looking at San Francisco, the Ninth Court in San Francisco may have ruled similar to what Chicago ruled, but for completely different reasons. So when those things arise over issues, that's when the Supreme Court will go ahead and determine that they're going to hear a case and make a decision on a case. So if it's early on in the process, and there are not a lot of opinions out there in the appellate courts on how a decision will be made, then chances are the Supreme Court will pass. And I want to say that the typical appeals rate to the Supreme Court is about 10% or so. So 90% or so of the cases that go to the Supreme Court generally don't get heard. Okay, and now the court also may combine cases in order to hear them, and that's very common. If you looked at the background of many of the cases that we're going to discuss throughout our course, you'll see that the court has combined those cases. So that's the idea on the federal level. Remember, 3 levels of courts: district, appellate, supreme. And our appellate court for Oklahoma is located at the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals in Denver. Now, the state court is somewhat similar in the sense that we have the same 3 levels of courts. We have a district court, and in fact, each county acts as its own district court. So we have 77 counties, and therefore we have 77 district courts in Oklahoma. When you want to question a law in Oklahoma, you start out at the county level at the district court. From there, we go up to 9 appeals courts. We have 9 appeals courts in Oklahoma. And then from there, just like at the federal system, you go to the Supreme Court. Now, Oklahoma is one of only 2 states where we have actually 2 Supreme Courts. We have the Court of Criminal Appeals and the Court of Civil Appeals. The difference here is between civil laws and criminal laws. And the other state, I believe, is Texas, who has this type of system. So the Court of Criminal Appeals is the last resort for criminal cases brought by the governments for breaking the law, and the Court of Civil Appeals is for civil laws. And we'll talk about civil liability later on in the course. When you go to the state capitol in Oklahoma City and look at the Supreme Court, such a nice room with giant columns that support the House of Representatives. If you ever take that tour, they'll explain that to you. Very ornate in there. That is the criminal appeals court. Okay, the civil appeals court is down the hall in a very somewhat nondescript room compared to the criminal appeals court. So anyway, Oklahoma, we have 2 Supreme Courts for the state. So just to break it down a little bit better, this is not the best map, but you can see here how the appeals courts are broken down by counties. Remember what I said, every county has is a district court, and from there it goes to 9 appeals courts, and from there it's appealed to one of either 2 Supreme Courts in Oklahoma City. So Tulsa is located in Appeals Court District number 6. Tahlequah and Broken Arrow are located in Appeals Court District number 7. So that's how the Oklahoma system works. Now, specifically talking about education. So first of all, we know that education is a state issue because the 10th Amendment makes it a state issue. The 10th Amendment states the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. And so therefore, because education is not specifically mentioned, the founders did not include education. At that time, there was no need to include education. It was a minor issue compared to other things. Whether or not education needs to become a national issue is probably up for debate, I think. Personally, I tend to lean on the side we should probably look more toward a national issue, but where that's going to go in light of our current political climate is slim to nowhere. It's probably going to be moved backwards as opposed to moving forward. But that's just a personal opinion. But nonetheless, it is a state issue, so that means we need to look at our state constitution and see what our state constitution says about school. So in Article 13, Section 13-1 of the state constitution, our Constitution dictates the legislature shall establish and maintain a system of free public schools wherein all children of the state may be educated. Further, in the same section, the legislature shall, by appropriate legislation, raise and appropriate funds for annual support of the common schools of the state. So the legislature is responsible for raising money to support public schools in Oklahoma. Still further, the legislature shall, by appropriate legislation, such money shall be allocated to the various school districts in the manner and by distributing agency to be designated by the legislature. And we will learn in just a minute that distributing agency is going to be the State Department of Education. So the legislature is going to appropriate money. The State Department of Education shall distribute that money. And then later on in that same section, the legislature shall, by appropriate legislation, amount of state funds shall be determined by the distributing agency upon terms and conditions specified by the legislature. In other words, the legislature is going to tell the State Department how much money they get on an annual basis. That same section, 13-4, talking about compulsory attendance, the legislature shall provide for the compulsory attendance. In other words, attendance is mandatory by law at some public or other school unless other means of education are provided. All the children in the state are in sound mind and body between the ages of 8 and 16 years for at least 3 months. Well, that was what the legislature originally said, and of course now we know that has changed. But keep in mind that that was the original Constitution, 3 months a year between the ages of 8 and 16 back in 1907. Subsection 5, a Board of Education, the supervision of instruction in public schools shall be vested in a Board of Education whose power and duties shall be prescribed by law. The Superintendent of Public Instruction shall be President of the Board until otherwise provided by law. The Governor, Secretary of State, and Attorney General shall be ex officio members and with the Superintendent compose the said Board of Education. So this is the supervisory body for the state. And of course we do have a State Board of Education. And it is headed by our state superintendent in Oklahoma. This is, of course, as you know, an elected position for the state superintendent. Article 1, Section 8. We're jumping back to the federal Constitution here. The power of Congress to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and exercises to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. One more example here from the federal constitution: to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. The reason that we see this here, why we jump back to the federal constitution, is because even though we talked about the fact that education is a state issue, obviously the federal government has some stake in education. The State Department of Education, or the Federal Department of Education, was created under President Carter in the late 70s. And through these two clauses, the Commerce Clause and the General Welfare Clause in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, the federal government is going to secure a role in education. And that did not start with President Carter. He only instituted the Department of Education. It actually started back with President Johnson in 1965 when he passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which we know today as Every Child Succeeds Act. Before that, it was, of course, No Child Left Behind. But anyway, so even though we talk about the federal government not having a distinct role, what we see here is the federal government has used the Constitution to say that in order to provide for the general welfare and in order to regulate commerce among the several states, the federal government is going to get involved in education, even though education is a state level issue. And that brings up a point that some people criticize and say the federal government should get out of education. But keep in mind that typically the average school in Oklahoma receives about 10% of its funding from the federal government. And a medium-sized school district of about 750 students with a budget of about $5.5 million. If we were to say we want the federal government out of education, then what that means for that school district is the budget is cut by 10%, a little more than $500,000, which equates to about 10 teachers. So you can't just say we want the federal government out of education and lose that money, even though it's a small amount of money. So just keep that in mind as we go through. The First Amendment. So now we're going to look at some of the Constitution amendments that we're going to mainly deal with. So keep in mind, when we're talking earlier about the Supreme Court of the United States, the number one reason that an issue goes before the Supreme Court is because people are saying that a law violates the Constitution. And so everything that we read about, whatever the case is, it's going to be tied to the Constitution. And so I want you to be cognizant of that as you're reading through the cases. What is the constitutional issue? You'll hear the Supreme Court all the time asking, what's the constitutional issue of this case? So with that in mind, I want to hit the most common constitutional issues that we're going to deal with. And all these are dealing with amendments. I believe they all deal with amendments for what we're looking at. So, of course, the First Amendment covers a lot. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So there are two parts to the religion clause here. The Establishment Clause and the Freedom Clause. The Establishment meaning the government is not going to establish your religion. The Freedom Clause meaning people are free to practice their religion. Or abridging the freedom of speech. We have a complete module over that. We have a complete module over religion. Or the press. We have a module over press. In our case, we're talking about student publications. The right to peaceably assemble. We will talk about that. And the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. We don't really deal with petitioning the government, but we will talk about peaceably assembling in an indirect sense that's tied to some of these others like freedom of speech. And all this will make sense to you, I promise, as we go through the course. The next amendment that we'll really hit on is the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment says it's the right of the people to secure in their person, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, so forth and so forth. So search and seizure certainly comes into play when we're dealing with education and students' rights and teachers' rights concerning when a school can, or when school leaders can search a student. How far can that search go? If we suspect a student has cigarettes on them or something more uh, uh, significant as drugs or even weapons, how far can that search go? Do we need probable cause, and what does probable cause mean? We're going to talk about all that when we deal with search and seizures. The Ninth Amendment, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. This comes into play because education is a special arena. And so what we're going to see, especially when we're talking about things like the Fourth Amendment of search and seizure, is that even though this is a right that's given to people, how far does this right carry into public schools? And should students in public schools expect to have the same level of rights as they do as citizens of the United States? And so the Ninth Amendment is going to come into play here when we're talking about how far these rights are concerned. So keep in mind, what in the big picture, we're saying that everybody has these rights, but these are not unlimited rights. Okay, you have the right to freedom of the speech, but as Justice Holmes said, that does not extend to you crying fire in a crowded theater. Okay, so there are limits to these rights, and so what we're going to see in education is that there are going to be differences as to what the Supreme Court rules limits to these rights are as a citizen versus limits to these rights as a student in a public school setting. Okay, so again, that's why the Ninth Amendment is going to come into play here. And then we're going to come back to the 14th Amendment in a minute. These are a little bit out of order. The Fifth Amendment is the other one of the Bill of Rights that are going to be discussed quite a bit here. And this is the Due Process Amendment. Okay, no person shall be held to answer for capital or otherwise infamous crime, nor shall any person be in subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process, nor shall private property be taken from public use without just compensation. So this really deals with students a little bit, but this is really going to come into play when we move into the latter part of our class when we're talking about teachers' rights, okay, and what we mean when we say liberty rights, property rights, and bringing in due process. And so all of that's going to make more sense, but keep in mind again, what these are as a citizen of the country and as a person within a public education institution, the Supreme Court is going to determine what these things mean. Now, one thing I want to introduce here as well is the way that we're going to see cases, and we'll talk more about this as we move on in the first few modules. But if you can think of the Supreme Court as the Supreme Court decisions somewhat like a tree, okay, there's going to be one solid case that sets the foundation of the Supreme Court. And then what we're going to see is the Supreme Court will come back and interpret different aspects of that case, and those decisions will become branches off of that trunk. And so when you hear the Supreme Court issue a ruling, you're going to hear them refer to a lot of different cases. And the reason they're referring to all these different cases is they're working their way through this massive tree that we call judicial opinion, and explaining how they reached the decision they did. Okay. For example, when we look at the Fifth Amendment, this is pretty straightforward. You can't be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. But what does property mean? What does liberty mean? We can say property might mean something you own, but when we're talking about education, do you own your job? If you own your job, then can the school take that away without due process? At what point do you own your job? So all this will come out, but keep in mind what I said. So when the textbook, Alexander and Alexander start talking about an issue, what they're going to do is they're typically going to start from the trunk of the tree. They're going to start with the big cases. And then as you read through the text in each chapter, you're going to see them branch off into these separate little cases. And each of those little cases is just defining one more aspect of what the previous cases said. But always look for that root case so that you understand the broad decision. Okay. So for example, I'm going to give you just one example. When we talk about freedom of speech, the root case is going to be Tinker. Actually, the root case goes back to the 20s. The very first case they talked about freedom of speech. But right above that, the root case is going to be Tinker. And so Tinker is going to set the precedent for various other cases, and those other cases are going to be all the limbs that you will read about. So anyway, it's just an analogy of why we see so many cases dealing with a certain issue. The last amendment that I want to mention is probably the most important, and this is the 14th Amendment. Now, the 14th Amendment, I believe, was passed in 1868 as part of the Civil War Amendments 13, 14, and 15. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment came in and defined who an American citizen was. And so at that point, it's going to define former slaves as American citizens. But it also says, it brings up due process here again. It says, nor shall a state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdictions the equal protections of the law. The 14th Amendment is important because initially the Bill of Rights only applied to the federal government. So when we say in the First Amendment that a person has freedom of religion, freedom to practice whatever religion they want, that applied to the federal government. The federal government could not come in and deny somebody the right to practice their religion. But the states could, because the federal Constitution only applied to federal law. And so over time, what we see is pieces of the Bill of Rights interpreted through the 14th Amendment, with the use of the 14th Amendment, interpreted to mean that they apply to the states as well. And this is called enumeration. And so once an aspect of the Bill of Rights is enumerated down to the state level, that means it applies at the state. Okay. And while I abhor using Wikipedia as a source in graduate work, and even in undergraduate work for that matter, it's always a good place to start. Okay, so if you were to go to Wikipedia and look up enumeration of the Constitution, what I do enjoy about that piece there is that there is a list of all the rights under the Bill of Rights and it gives you the case and the year that that specific piece of the amendment or the amendment itself was enumerated to the state level. Okay, and so it's interesting to note that uh, as of now, I believe all the Bill of Rights have been enumerated to the state level, but the last one was only done in 2010. And believe it or not, it was the Second Amendment. So up until 2010, states could, if they wanted to, pass laws restricting gun ownership in the states. In other words, they could simply outlaw guns if they wanted to. But in 2010, I believe it's 2010, you have to look it up, but the Second Amendment was finally enumerated down to the state level. And so at that point, the Second Amendment applied to the states as well and not just the federal government. So keep in mind, as part of our federal system, we somewhat have two jurisdictions operating somewhat independent of each other. We have the federal system, and we have the state system. Okay. Another reason that I say the 14th Amendment is one of the most important, not the most important amendment, is that when the Supreme Court asks what constitutional issue is at hand, they don't just say it's the First Amendment, freedom of religion. They typically say it's the 14th Amendment and then the First Amendment. So everything flows through the 14th Amendment. So those are the amendments to the Constitution that we will concentrate on through our class, and so that is why, or whenever we look at a case, I want you to think of the constitutional issue at hand, and it's going to tie to one of these amendments. So real quickly, the last few minutes here. Within Oklahoma, who are the school players? We're going to look a little bit about Oklahoma and how our system is set up. So in the Oklahoma, we have, of course, the State Department of Education, overseen by the State Board of Education, which is ran by the state superintendent, an elected official in Oklahoma. At the local level, schools are ran by boards, school boards. School boards have a president, a vice president, clerk, could be an encumbrance clerk, at least those three people, and they typically rotate around the board. These are, of course, elected positions to schools, so in that sense, it is truly a democratic process the way our schools are ran. We have certified personnel within the school. These include the superintendent, the principal, teaching principal. We don't have teaching principals anymore. Well, I guess we do in some schools. And just a few years ago, I knew of a teaching superintendent. So, but we have superintendents, principals, and teachers. Sometimes a nurse, sometimes an entry-level teacher, student teacher. Student teacher is not necessarily a certified person in the district as of yet, but they will be. Classified, anyone else in the district who is employed. So certified means that the state legislature has set a law saying that each person requesting or desiring to fill a position must meet certain requirements. And the State Department of Ed then, as the body established by the legislature, certifies those requirements are met. School districts, section 55 of the same article, as a body corporate may sue and may be sued. We will talk about that later on in the course, but know that a district may sue and may be sued. School district is a political subdivision of the state. Whenever you see AG 1971 or AG anything, AG is an attorney general opinion. So typically what we do when we look in the law for opinions at the state level, specifically if we can't find a law specifically answering a question, we quite often look to see what the Attorney General said. Now, keep in mind the Attorney General is the head lawyer in the state, basically. That person is head of the law for the executive branch, so it's not head of the legislative or the judicial branch, it's head of law for the executive branch. So what the Attorney General says is very important. And so the Attorney General says, in 1971, the school district is a political subdivision of the state. Therefore, we are state employees, so no surprise there. You have two types of school districts in Oklahoma. You have independent districts. Size of the independent districts does not matter, whether it's land area or student population. What does matter in an independent district is that it is a PK to 12 district. Okay, and there are generally 7 board members. Sometimes you may have 5, but that is the key thing in an independent district, is that it goes all the way to grade 12. Elementary districts or dependent districts, again, size does not matter. Land area or student population. What we're looking at here is if elementary districts or dependent districts are K-8 schools, and they typically have 3 school boards. Okay, 3 board members on their school boards. In Oklahoma, the school year right now, by law, by constitutional law, is set at 180 days. That includes 175 teaching days and 5 professional days. The law was changed a few years ago, of course, that went by hours. And so if a district adopts a policy that says they're going to count hours instead of days, then they need a total of 1,080 hours a year as opposed to 180 days a year, which of course the 6-hour days can equal the same. And this is why districts will still schedule 180 days on their calendar, but if their days are 6 hours and 20 minutes long, they can bank those extra hours. And that's why you see districts letting school out earlier than normal in the spring. It's because they didn't use snow days and they didn't use any snow days, and they had those other hours banked. Okay, so let's take just a few minutes here and go over a few questions for review. Okay, we're not going to do this on everyone. In fact, I think this is probably the only one presentation that we'll have reviewed. But according to the Oklahoma Constitution, the main supervision of instruction is vested in whom? Supervision of instruction is vested in the State Board of Education. In which federal court circuit is Oklahoma? It is located in Denver, Colorado, and the answer is the 10th Circuit. Which of the following is the highest court in Oklahoma? The Oklahoma Supreme Court, the Court of Criminal Appeals, A and B, or none of the above. And as we said, Oklahoma is one of the unique states that has 2 Supreme Courts. So we are A and B there. The authority of states to have public school is granted by which of the amendments to the Constitution? So which amendment gives states the right to have public schools? This, of course, is the 10th Amendment, because those rights not given to the states, not denied to the states, nor given to the federal government, are automatically given to the states. Free public schools in Oklahoma were first guaranteed by what? That is the Oklahoma Constitution. A couple of more. According to the Oklahoma Constitution, who is required to maintain a system of free public education in Oklahoma? The body in charge of maintaining the free public system is the legislature. Whether or not they do that's up to opinion. Which of the following is not mentioned in the First Amendment? Speech, voting, petitioning, religion. Of course, the answer is the right to vote. 2 more. The difference between an independent school district and an elementary or dependent school district is the number of board members, land area grant, or grade offerings, population size. The main thing here is going to be grade offerings. Okay, grade offerings. Not the number of board members is different, but that's as a result of the great offerings. Okay, so the great offerings are the first thing there. And finally, the last question: if a school board's uh, policy is in compliance with federal law and is more stringent than federal law, the board policy will not supersede federal law. In other words, if the board policy says what federal law says, but it's actually tougher than federal law, then this question is saying that's illegal. It cannot be tougher. And actually, the correct answer here is false. Okay, it at least has to meet federal law. If it goes beyond that, then that's up to the board of the state. So with that, you now have the basic foundation of how the courts work, the foundation for education in Oklahoma through our Constitution, and through the Constitution of the United States, giving states the rights to do that, and the basic idea of schools in Oklahoma. So with that, that finishes this presentation, and we will move to the next one.